NBS History presents the Battle of Midway, in remembrance and respect to all those who lost their lives. It is December the 7th, 1941,
a date which will live in infamy,
as the Empire of Japan has attacked Pearl Harbor. The rationale for the attack was to wipe out as much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet as possible, in order to give the Japanese enough time to occupy and fortify islands in the Pacific. In the words of Admiral Hiryū Tadahashi, when asked about the results of the Pearl Harbor attack, "We won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor, and thereby lost the war." What was evident by the attack was, while impressive, the IJN failed to destroy U.S. aircraft carriers, who were not stationed at the harbor during the attack. Thus, the U.S. still had a hurt but workable Pacific Fleet to counterattack. The IJN invaded the Philippines, French Indochina, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, securing their valuable resources such as oil, rubber, and iron. The Japanese High Command had a few months to fortify their positions in the Pacific, but now had a new problem. With the U.S. fleet still intact, they needed a decisive victory naval battle to get the U.S. out of the Pacific if there was any chance to win this war. Commander-in-Chief of the fleet, Isoroku Yamamoto's primary strategic goal was to eliminate the U.S. carrier forces, which he regarded to be the principal threat to the Pacific campaign. This was heightened after the 1942 Doolittle raid, in which 16 U.S. B-52s bombed Tokyo, launching from the U.S. Hornet. While this raid did little damage, it was a psychological bombshell for Japan. The U.S. carriers must be destroyed to protect the home island. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was reluctant to be drawn into an all-out naval battle, while Yamamoto required this to occur to make a decisive victory. The U.S. had a few successful hit-and-run raids using their carrier, and this led Yamamoto to consider another attack on Pearl Harbor to draw the entire U.S. fleet into battle. However, increased land-based air power on Hawaiian Islands since the attack led this idea to be far too risky. Yamamoto made the decision to select Midway, a tiny atoll island at the northeast of the Hawaiian island chain, as a spot for a decisive naval battle. Midway was approximately 1,300 miles from Oahu and outside the effective range of almost all U.S. aircraft stationed on Hawaiian Islands. While Midway was of no importance to Japan's war strategy, Yamamoto figured it would be considered a vital outpost for the U.S. and thus could be used to compel them to defend it vigorously. Yamamoto's battle plan for taking Midway, named Operation MI, required the coordination of multiple battle groups over hundreds of miles of open sea. His intelligence told him that the USS Enterprise and Hornet, forming Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, were the only carriers available to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. This would be proven to be fatally false information. May 1942, the IJN attempted to seize control of the Coral Sea between Australia and New Caledonia by establishing air bases at Port Moresby in New Guinea and Tulagi. Unfortunately for them, U.S. intelligence learned of this plan and altered all available sea and air power. While the Japanese landed at Tulagi on May the 3rd, carrier-based planes from Admiral Frank J. Fletcher's Task Force 17 struck them, sinking one destroyer, some minesweepers, and land barges. The main Japanese invasion force, as a result, made a circuitous route to the east to invite a clash with Fletcher's forces. On May the 5th and the 6th, 1942, opposing carrier groups hunted each other, and on the morning of May the 7th, IJN carrier planes sank a U.S. destroyer and oiler. Fletcher's planes sank the light carrier Shōryū and a cruiser in retaliation. The next day, Japanese aircrafts sank the U.S. carrier Lexington and damaged carrier Yorktown. Fletcher's fighters managed to cripple the IJN large carrier Shokaku, forcing it to retire from action. The Japanese also lost about 69 aircrafts. Both sides publicly claimed victory after the Battle of Coral Sea. In terms of losses, the Japanese won a tactical victory, having sank a carrier, an oiler, and a destroyer, versus losing a light carrier, a destroyer, and several smaller warships. However, from a strategic perspective, the Allies averted the seaborne invasion of Port Moresby, lessening the threat to the supply lines between the U.S. and Australia, and the Japanese had to abandon the operation at Coral Sea. The most significant effect of the Coral Sea battle was the loss of carriers Shokaku and Zukaku, which Yamamoto required for his planned battle in the air against the US carriers at Midway. The Japanese believed they sank 2 carriers, Lexington and Yorktown, in the Coral Sea, leaving US carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Unknown to Yamamoto, there was a 3rd surviving carrier. Yorktown, despite being damaged, managed to return to Hawaii and was repaired in 2 weeks. On top of all of this, the Japanese combined fleet would have much fewer aircrafts at Midway, having lost so many at the Coral Sea, while the US would have significantly more. Despite the Coral Sea setback, the Japanese continued with plans to seize Midway Island and bases in the Aleutians. In order to obtain the IGA's support for Midway, they were required to open a route of invasion of the US by taking the Aleutian islands of Attu and Kiska. Taking these islands made the Japan the first foreign nation to occupy US soil since the War of 1812, and drove fear that these islands would be used as staging points for Japanese bombers to hit the US. However, this operation removed many more ships that would be required for the Battle of Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz expected the Japanese to muster 4 to 5 carriers. He ordered Vice Admiral William Hazley's, whom Raymond Spruance was sitting in for, 2 carrier task force, Enterprise and Hornet, at hand. He also hurriedly recalled Fletcher's task force, including the carrier Yorktown, whom had just been repaired. Admiral Nimitz also had another critical advantage. U.S. cryptanalysts had partially broken the IGN's JN-25B code. Using the code breakers, he was able to confirm that Midway was the target and that the battle would occur either on the 4th or the 5th of June. He also had the complete IGN order of battle. This meant he would have a good picture of where, when, and in what strength the IGN would appear. He knew now that the IGN had divided their ships into 4 separate task groups, 2 widely separated to be able to support another. Now for you World of Warship guys. Overall, the US had 3 fleet carriers, USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. 7 heavy cruisers, the Minneapolis, New Orleans, Portland, Astoria, Northampton, Pensacola, and Vincennes. 1 light cruiser, the Atlanta, 15 destroyers, 16 submarines, 233 carrier aircrafts, and 127 land-based aircrafts. The Japanese had 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Hiryū, Kaga, and Sōryū, 2 battleships, Yamato, and Kirishima, 6 heavy cruisers, Mikuyama, Mogami, Chikuyama, the Ton, Yatago, and the Suzuya, 1 light cruiser, 14 destroyers, 28 float planes, and 248 carrier-based aircraft. Also, for the Japanese, there were 2 light carriers, 5 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 35 support ships present, but they did not participate in the battle. This was because of the well-planned US tactics using the broken Japanese code to know where the ships were so they could evade them. June the 3rd, 1942, around 9 a.m., Jack Reed, piloting a PBY, Catalina Long-Range Maritime Patrol Flying Boat, spots a Japanese occupation force 580 miles southwest of Midway and mistakenly reports it as the main task force. B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers take off from Midway at 12:30 for the first airstrike. They find Tanaka's occupational transport group, and under heavy anti-aircraft fire, they drop bombs, reporting 4 ships hit. They were unaware. They hit almost nothing and did no real significant damage. On June the 4th, at 4:30, Nagumo launches his first strike wave on Midway from carriers Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, with 36 Aichi D-3A Val carrier-borne bomber and dive bombers, and 36 Nakajima B-5N bombers, Kate carrier-borne torpedo bomber, escorted by 36 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters. He also launched 8 search aircrafts 30 minutes late. As Nagumo's aircrafts are taking off, 11 PBYs leave Midway to run search patterns. At 5:34, a PBY reports sighting of 2 IGN carriers. Midway's radar picks up enemies and interceptors are scrambled. Unescorted US bombers head off to attack Japanese carriers while their fighter escorts remain to defend Midway. Midway's air sirens begin blaring at 6:20. The Japanese aircrafts bomb and heavily damage US oil tanks and anti-air weapons. The bombing does not disable runways and/or heavy defensive weaponry. Midway Marine fighters led by Major Floyd B. Parks scramble, including 6 F-4 F-Fs Wildcat carrier-borne fighter, 20 F-2As Buffalo fighters, to intercept the Japanese, suffering heavy losses but managed to destroy 4 B-5Ns and 1 Zero. Within the first minutes, 2 F-4Fs and 13 F-2As are destroyed. U.S. anti-aircraft fire manages to destroy 3 additional Japanese aircrafts. Of the 108 Japanese aircraft involved in this attack, 11 are destroyed, 14 heavily damaged, and 29 moderately damaged, while 3 are ditched. Midway is not neutralized, and U.S. bombers can still refuel on the airbase. Japanese pilots report to Nagumo that a second aerial attack on Midway is necessary for the invasion force to get ashore on June the 7th. U.S. bombers launch from Hornet and Enterprise to make several attacks on the Japanese carrier force. Included with these are 6 Grumman Avengers carrier-borne torpedo bombers, 11 SB-2U-3s Vindicator dive bombers, 16 SBDs Dauntless carrier-borne dive bomber, 4 B-26s Marauder medium bombers armed with torpedoes, and 15 B-17s. The Avengers miss the carriers with torpedoes, the Vindicators fail to score hits, and the B-17s are far too high of an altitude to make any hits either. The Japanese repel the attack, losing 3 fighters, and destroy 5 TBFs, 2 SBW-2Us, 8 SBDs, and 2 B-26s. One B-26 becomes severely damaged from anti-aircraft fire and makes a suicidal run at flagship Akagi. The aircraft narrowly misses, crashing into the carrier's bridge, which would have killed Nagumo and his command staff. This experience raises the Japanese morale. The pilot's recommendation for a second attack makes Nagumo determined to launch another attack on Midway, in direct violation of Yamamoto's orders to keep the reserve strike force armed with anti-ship operations. At 7:15, Nagumo orders his reserve planes to rearm with contact-fuse bombs to use against Midway land targets. At 7:40, a scout plane from the Tone reports a sizable U.S. naval force to the east, but neglects to describe its composition. Nagumo does not get this report until 8 o'clock. Nagumo quickly reverses his rearm order and demands the scout plane to assert the composition of the U.S. naval force. After 40 minutes elapse, the scout reports a single carrier of Task Force 16. Nagumo has a dilemma. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, leading carrier Hiryū and Sōryū, tells him to strike immediately with the forces at hand, 18 Aichi D-3A1 dive bombers. Nagumo's opportunity to hit the U.S. ships was now limited by the imminent return of his Midway strike force, whom needed his carrier's decks cleared to be able to land, or they would be forced to ditch at sea.
第二次攻撃隊を鉄空母に向けましょう。いや、今出したところで積んでるのは陸用爆弾だ。甲板に穴ぐらい開けられます。上空の直縁についてる戦闘機隊はどうするんだ。もう燃料がない。一旦着艦させてもならん。そんな余裕はありません。護衛なしで攻撃隊は出せん。
Nagumo makes the decision to wait for his strike force to land and then launch his reserves, but this also means he is vulnerable to attack. The U.S. carriers begin launching aircrafts once the Japanese carriers have been scouted. At 7 o'clock, Enterprise and Hornet launch first planes. Fletcher, upon Yorktown, follows at 8 o'clock. Unlike Enterprise and Hornet, Fletcher acquired first-hand experience in organizing a full strike against enemy aircraft carriers at the Coral Sea battle, and orders the striking aircraft to proceed to target immediately and not waste time making strike force formations, because he knew neutralizing carriers was the key to survival for his task force. Japanese naval doctrine at this point is to launch a large group of fighters and never in small batches known as piecemeals. U.S. forces, however, do launch piecemeals, proceeding at their targets in several smaller groups. The idea behind this was that the constant aerial attacks would impair the enemy to launch counterstrikes. This was also a gamble, as smaller groups would receive larger casualties if attacked. Fletcher was gambling that Nagumo's flight decks would be in vulnerable positions. At 9:20, Waldron Squadron sights enemy carriers. Without fighter escorts, 15 TBD Devastators with Navy torpedoes are shot down. Mitsubishi Zero fighters make short work of the unescorted TBDs, and a few TBDs manage to launch torpedoes, but also miss or fail to explode. These failures, however, force IGN carriers to go off balance and make them unable to launch counterattacks. Alongside this, Zeros begin to run low on ammunition and need to refuel, clogging up the carrier decks and leaving them vulnerable. 3 squadrons of SBDs from Enterprise and Yorktown now approach from southwest and northeast, extremely low on fuel, but choose to continue the search. They come across the IGN destroyer Arashi, streaming full speed to rejoin Nagumo's carrier force. Nimitz stated the decision to continue the search and not refuel had decided the fate of Carrier Task Force and our forces at Midway. All 3 squadrons arrived simultaneously at perfect times, locations, and altitudes to attack. At this point, most of the Japanese aircraft that are flying are low on ammunition, and the rest are refueling on the carriers. This scramble to refuel also meant that bombs and torpedoes were stacked around the hangars rather than stowed safely in the magazines, making those carriers literal powder kegs. At 10:22, 2 squadrons of Enterprise split up to attack Kaga and Akagi. A miscommunication causes both to dive at Kaga. Recognizing the error, 2 aircrafts pull towards Akagi, judging Kaga is already doomed. Kaga receives 5 direct hits, causing heavy damage and multiple fires. 1 bomb lands near the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of the ship's superior officers. Lieutenant Clarence E. Dixon recalls, "We were coming down in all directions on the port side of the carrier. I recognized her as the Kaga, and she was enormous. The target was utterly satisfying. I saw a bomb hit just behind where I was aiming. I saw the deck, rippling and curling back in all directions, exposing a great section of the hangar below. I saw my 500-pound bomb hit right abreast of the carrier. The 2 100-pound bombs struck in the forward area of the parked planes." Mitsuyo Fujita, a Japanese aviator on the Akagi, also recalled, "A lookout screamed, 'Hell divers!' I looked up to see 3 black enemy planes plummeting towards our ship. Some of our machine guns managed to fire a few frantic bursts at them, but it was too late. The plump silhouettes of the American Dauntless dive bombers quickly grew larger, and then a number of black objects suddenly floated eerily from their wings. Akagi sustains 1 direct hit, which proves to be a fatal blow. The bomb struck the edge of the midship deck elevator, penetrating the hangar deck and exploding with the armed and fueled aircraft in the vicinity. This killed many and spread a terrific fire which was impossible to get under control. Yorktown's VB-3s, commanded by Max Leslie, went for the Sōryū, attacking and hitting 3 times, causing extreme damage. The VT-3s targeted Hiryū, but did not achieve any real hits from this. Within 6 minutes, the sole surviving aircraft was Hiryū, wasting no time to counterattack. Hiryū's first wave consisted of 18 D-3As with 6 escorts, which followed the retreating U.S. aircrafts and attacked the first carrier they would come across. They hit Yorktown with 3 bombs, blowing a hole in the deck, forcing Fletcher to move his command staff to heavy cruiser Astoria. Yorktown was unable to resume air operations as a result of her injury. 1 hour later, Hiryū's second attack wave, consisting of 10 B-5Ns and 6 escorting Zero fighters, arrived over Yorktown, which had been repaired so effectively they assumed it was an undamaged carrier. They attack crippling Yorktown with 2 torpedoes, but lose 5 bombers and 2 fighters. News comes back stating that 2 U.S. carriers have been sunk, greatly improving Japanese morale, but this is false information. The few surviving aircraft return aboard Hiryū. Despite heavy losses, the Japanese scrapped together enough aircraft for 1 more strike against what they believed to be only 1 remaining aircraft carrier. Late in the afternoon, a Yorktown aircraft located Hiryū, prompting the Enterprise to launch a final strike of 24 SBD dive bombers. Despite Hiryū being covered by a dozen Zero fighters, the attack managed to hit 4 times, leaving Hiryū ablaze and unable to operate aircrafts. Hornet's airstrikes, however, were quite late and did little to the remaining escort ships. After futile attempts to extinguish the fire, the crew of the Hiryū were evacuated and the remainder of the fleet continued sailing northeast in an attempt to intercept the U.S. carriers. Hiryū would sink, and Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi and Captain Tomoyo Kaku chose to go down with the ship, costing Japan possibly their best carrier officers. Once night fell, both sides took stock and made plans for continued action. Fearing a night attack from the Japanese and believing Yamamoto still intended to invade, Spruance changed course towards the enemy at midnight. Yamamoto decided to send his remaining surface forces to search eastward for the U.S. carriers while simultaneously sending a cruiser to bombard the island. The Japanese forces failed to make contact with the US because Spruance forces briefly withdrew eastward and Yamamoto ordered a general withdrawal west. If Yamamoto's heavy ships, including Yamato, found them in the dark, there was a high chance the US carriers would have all been sunk. Over the following 2 days, several strikes were launched against stragglers, first from Midway and then from US carriers. Mikuma was sunk by Dauntlesses, while Mogami received severe damage. The Yorktown, barely holding on, was evacuated after salvage efforts deemed hopeless, and it sank at 5 o'clock on June the 7th. By this time, the battle ended. Akagi lost 267, Kaga 811, the Hiryū 392, and the Sōryū 711 personnel. Heavy cruiser Mikuma lost 700, Mogami 92, destroyers Arashio 35, Asasio 21, Tanikaze 11, Arasashi 1, Kazagumo 1, just to give you an idea of the death figures. The Japanese lost 4 carriers, one heavy cruiser was severely damaged, and 248 aircraft were destroyed. This combined was 3,057 Japanese killed, 37 taken prisoner, and a few were interrogated and actually provided great intelligence later in the war. The US lost Yorktown and destroyer Raymond, 150 aircraft, and 307 Americans died, including Major General Clarence L. Tinker. This included 3 prisoners who were later killed: Wesley Osmos, a Yorktown pilot, Frank O'Flaherty, an Enterprise pilot, and aviation machinist Mate Bruno. Nagumo stated that Osmos died on June the 6th and was buried at sea. O'Flaherty's fate was never mentioned, and Osmos was executed by the captain of the Arasashi, Watanabe Yasumasa. Yasumasa died in 1943 when destroyer Numikaze sank. He would have been tried as a war criminal. The Battle of Midway has been called the turning point of the Pacific because it was the first Allied major naval victory against Japan. It was also won despite Japan having superior numbers and experience. Had the IJN won this battle, Midway would have been most likely taken, and the Saratoga would have been the only remaining US carrier in the entire Pacific. This could have led to the invasion of Fiji, Samoa, and further attacks on Australia, Alaska, Ceylon, and even Hawaii. In the time it took Japan to build 3 carriers, the US commissioned more than 24 fleet and light fleet carriers, alongside numerous escort carriers. The Japanese Navy never recovered, and the decisive victory never came. In the words, again, of Hara Tadaichi, Japan had indeed won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor and thereby lost the war.